One of the most common arguments you'll hear today about the U.S. Constitution is that while it grants people many rights and freedoms, it does not protect citizens from the consequences of our actions. At face value, this argument seems to make sense, but it often does not hold up under greater scrutiny. In fact, I'd argue that this has devolved into one of the dumbest arguments being made in policy discourse today. The problem lies in the way that most people make basic decisions. While we can all be prone to acting stupid at times, most of us are capable of doing a basic assessment of the potential positive and negative consequences of taking a certain action. Unless completely out of touch with reality, people do not make decisions in a vacuum, but instead look at the possible consequences, even if in a rudimentary or emotion-based way at times. People regularly assess the probable consequences of taking a certain action when acting as rational beings. This is a simple concept to understand in that consequences determine the likelihood of certain actions taken by people with a basic ability to act in their own self-interest. As a result of all this, when the government or any other entity imposes overly harsh consequences for taking a certain action supposedly protected by the Constitution, it is tantamount to taking away people's constitutional rights. Whether people can legally engage in activities protected by supposed free speech or freedom of the press is largely irrelevant if such choices can result in your expulsion from greater society, and particularly if it doesn't mesh with the mainstream leftist narrative today. When even an accusation of not adhering to an ideology can get you fined or have your reputation ruined, free speech is effectively neutralized. Similar problems exist with the right to bear arms and due process when, even though the worst case scenario of going to prison on a false charge may be avoided, the consequences of a false accusation or allegation are still severe enough that most people will usually choose not to speak out against this pressure to comply. In fact, one could extend the argument about consequences to an almost unlimited point, where as long as the government isn't directly harming you as a result of exercising your freedoms, it must be okay for certain consequences to take place, regardless of whether they're justified or reasonable. This can include being fired from a job for expressing a conservative viewpoint, especially in today's culture, today's environment, having your firearms taken away based on a false accusation of violent intent, or having your reputation in a community destroyed because of a false accusation of sexual misconduct. When the cultural and political environment allows for these kinds of abuses, whether one technically has these rights has only a reduced value when it comes to preserving these freedoms from a practical standpoint. Much of this false distinction between rights and consequences is a result of our education system teaching young people to misunderstand our rights and to buy into sophistry and fallacious arguments instead of realizing when those rights are being infringed. To a large degree, I think this is being done on purpose, as with many other things that we see going on today through the education system, so that children are indoctrinated more into only accepting leftist beliefs and to punish those with differing views. If people can be convinced that anything goes as long as you technically maintain your constitutional rights, then they will learn from an early age not to question the narrative that most of the political class wants us to buy into, even while justifying it all on the basis of being protected from the consequences that same political class often establishes to punish those who think differently. There are a couple of conclusions I think we should reach to all of this. One is that a distinction must be made between reasonable and unreasonable consequences of our actions and choices. Not everything can be justified on the basis of having certain guaranteed rights. Actually threatening someone's life, for example, or saying something with unfair prejudice about a particular group that's going to affect your job or something closely related to that, or doing something that jeopardizes your ability to perform your job in some sort of other way, typically should result in proportional negative consequences. Actually threatening someone's life saying something with unfair prejudice about a particular group of people, or doing something that jeopardizes your ability to perform your job should typically result in proportional negative consequences. But when these consequences are no longer proportional or are flat out politically motivated, the case for this argument doesn't hold up. The natural consequences of saying or doing something stupid has little to do with the politically correct, intolerant atmosphere generally prevalent today. The other important point is that in a society where all basic liberties are eventually taken away from people, the message does not typically start off with, "We're going to take your rights away now." Instead, sophistry like not being protected from the consequences of your actions will be used to justify the effective loss of your rights while maintaining the illusion that everyone's rights are actually intact. As an example, look at the number of supposedly conservative politicians who support using red flag laws to effectively take away one's right to bear arms whenever the accusation of a violent intent is made. And these laws vary by state in the states that have these laws, but that's still the gist of it in one form or another. There is little reason for widespread gun confiscation or an outright repeal of one's Second Amendment rights if your local government can just label you a threat and take your firearms regardless of whether you've committed an actual crime up until that point in time or not. The same goes for free speech. If people can be effectively silenced for holding unpopular views, or with due process, if people can be falsely accused with no evidence and subsequently lose access to many of life's essentials. Only in the final stage of this process does the infringement of rights become official policy, well after they've gone into disuse for all other intents and purposes. Ultimately, I think we need to realize that little will be done to reverse the current trend of things. Many conservatives will continue to praise our rights as enshrined in the Constitution, even while they are increasingly marginalized for their own beliefs and practice. Also, our education system will probably continue to encourage the idea that you aren't protected from the consequences of your speech or other actions, in order to justify basically any response that isn't directly prohibiting you from doing something. The main reason why I'm making this video is to show how ridiculous this argument has become and how many people don't really care about preserving the rights of others, regardless of whether it should be this way in theory. Our rights in practice are really important to look at, not just whether we theoretically still have these rights, even while in reality you're punished for not thinking a certain way oftentimes today. So I would recommend that everyone realize how compromised our rights in the United States and other Western countries as well, I'm sure, have become, and to tread with caution when exercising these rights. Almost anything can actually be justified now as it applies to someone with a dissenting belief system, even if it doesn't harm others and should be protected by the Constitution in theory. Your actions may not be protected nonetheless, if they do not fit in with the goals of the leftist establishment. This needs to be factored into any decision made going forward by those that realize this. In other words, guys, this idea of I can just say whatever I want as long as it doesn't hurt other people because it's protected by the Constitution, or I have my right to bear arms because it's in the Constitution, so no one can take my guns away, or I have due process rights, so anytime someone tries to accuse me of a crime or whatever, I'm protected. To a large extent, guys, this is not the case. The power contained within these rights is greatly reduced because in practice, things like, you don't have the right to be protected from the consequences of your actions, so we'll just use that as an excuse to violate your rights. That has become more and more common in practice, and a lot of people, even including myself in the past, really believe in this idea that, you're still responsible for whatever happens to you as a result of your speech or as a result of your choices. Well, does that mean that, essentially, as long as the government isn't deciding to execute you, it's okay if someone shoots you for saying something that is unpopular? Well, you have the right to free speech, but If someone decides that they don't like what you have to say and that person's essentially supported by the state, then they can just come in and kill you. Well, that's kind of a consequence for what you said. So that's how ridiculous this argument can be. But as long as the government isn't literally imprisoning you, a lot of people think that it's fine. And in reality, you see a lot of the underhanded things going on, like, well, we think you're violent because you have this view or you express this thought, so we're going to take your guns because you're not protected from, the consequences of saying what you said. It's all BS at that level, in my opinion. Especially, again, if it's proportional to what you've said, or if it affects your job, or it affects something else that, you're required or expected to do, then maybe there's proportional consequences that you deserve to have for saying or doing something stupid. But a lot of this has nothing to do with that. A lot of this is politically motivated, and again, this is the type of argument that is used instead of people actually realizing that their constitutional rights are being infringed on. Even a lot of conservatives will fall for this whole, you're protected in terms of your rights to do these things, but you're not protected from the consequences. Well, what if the consequence is we take your rights away? Well, that's okay because that's what you deserve somehow for saying or doing something, right? That's not illegal, but we don't like it because it doesn't go along with what the establishment, what the elites say is the view that you're supposed to have. I see a lot more of that kind of thinking going on, and it's just another way in the end of having your rights taken away. So be careful out there thinking that, well, you have free speech and you have due process and the right to bear arms and all these rights that are supposed to protect you, when in practice, a lot of the time those rights have really been blunted in terms of their power, right? A lot of the time, a false accusation or just saying the wrong thing that's not politically correct that the leftist elites don't support can get you in almost as much trouble as doing something that you are protected against, at least in a technical way, from going to prison. You may not go to prison for something, or you still may, depending on who's accusing you of what, but you've got to tread lightly or your livelihood can be ruined, even though these rights are supposed to be protected in the Bill of Rights in the Constitution.